Okay, we're on 10 o'clock. Welcome everybody to the Safety Action webinar for September. Here we have Andrea Rowe, General Manager of Safety Action. I'm hosting the webinar today with Sue Ellen Bennett, who is joining us from the office. Good morning, Sue Ellen.
Good morning.
And good morning to everyone that's joining us online, or to those of you that will that can't make it and will watch us in the recording later on. So today, and as always with our webinars, we take you through this month's newsletter. So the September newsletter, which you saw the cover, and if you haven't yet read your copy, we'll upload the link to the September newsletter in the chat. So keep an eye out for that. We will take you through the newsletter, including our question of the week. So when you see our question, feel free to have a guess at the answer, or tell us what you think the answer should be at the end of the webinar. We will tell you the correct answer there. We will talk about emergency planning and some of the weaknesses in many emergency plans and how to make a better emergency plan and implement it. As we come up to Are You OK Day, and also the increasing importance of considering the psychosocial hazards in the workplace, Sue Ellen's going to tell you about the 5 signs of distress to look out for in workers. And we tell you about a couple of safety incidents that have occurred, or convictions that have occurred lately. And we'll tell you what's coming up in next month's newsletter. So firstly, our question of the week, and most of these questions, or I think all of these questions that we pose to you, actually come from real questions that we get asked at Safety Action, and always really good questions. And so what our team do is, when we get asked one of these questions, often from companies that operate nationally, we actually go back to the legislation and check what the legal requirements are, and then check and tell you what the good practice requirements are as well. So this week we're asking, are fire alarms required in all workplaces? We'd love to know what you think, and we'll tell you the answer later on, but feel free to put your opinion, your comments in the chat. Now, we are talking about emergency planning in this month's newsletter, because if you didn't know, September is Fire Safety Month. So a key part of your fire safety should be a good emergency plan. So the first part is, who needs to have an emergency plan? All workplaces, they certainly have the obligation to make sure that all occupants can safely escape the workplace if there's an emergency, such as a fire. We believe ensuring everyone can safely evacuate in an emergency is a fundamental element of due diligence. So you certainly should have this in place. Under the WHS laws, there are specific obligations to have an emergency plan in place. In Victoria, our OHS regulations don't specifically have this obligation, other than your general duty in the Act, but the dangerous goods regulations have specific requirements. Also, if your site has dangerous goods in quantities exceeding manifest quantity, you should have a look at those requirements, because there are some specific requirements for emergency planning if you're a dangerous goods site. Something else you need to keep in mind is that the state fire authorities will have specific requirements for your emergency plan if you're a dangerous goods licensed site. And also, a lot of people miss this in the regulations, but it exists in the WHS regulations and the Vic dangerous goods regulations, that you need to request the advice of the fire authority when preparing your emergency plan, and also when reviewing your emergency plan every 5 years. So if you haven't done that, make sure you're aware of that obligation if you're a dangerous goods manifest site, and you do that. Now, also with your emergency planning, we do see a lot of businesses have emergency plans, but there are certainly this is certainly an area that needs to continue to evolve with changes in workplaces and changes in external situations. So traditional emergency plans focused on fire or natural disasters and certainly have a focus on making sure people can escape the workplace in the event of a fire, which is really critical. But it's also really important to consider external events, external emergencies, such as in Melbourne, we experienced a few years ago some very significant chemical fires, which impacted many workplaces. So it's important for your workplace to consider what would you do if there was toxic fumes outside of the workplace. You need to build into your emergency plans what you can do to keep your people safe, such as isolating air conditioning and closing doors and windows, and avoiding as much as possible toxic fumes from coming into the workplace. Also, with emergency situations, some businesses are more frequently considering deliberate actions intending to cause harm. So up until a few years ago, many workplaces didn't think of the threat of somebody, deliberately driving a vehicle onto their premises, or deliberately driving it into a vehicle, or deliberately using a vehicle to harm people. More frequently, this is becoming an area that businesses do identify in their emergency assessments, also considering the potential for protests, violent customers, or even terrorists. Also, keep in mind that a personal medical emergency is commonly the most likely emergency situation at many workplaces. So make sure you don't forget this one in your emergency planning. Also, when thinking about what are the potential emergency scenarios at your workplace, look at the incident data and find out what sort of emergencies or near misses are happening. Talk to your local emergency authorities, including the police and fire departments. And also talk to your neighbouring premises and find out what their activities are and what the dangers are, to know whether an emergency at that neighbouring premises could also impact on your site. So that's part one. Part two is actually preparing the emergency response plan. The most important thing you can do is make sure those procedures are clear, straightforward, and easy for your people to follow in the event of emergency. So you'll have clear response procedures for each of those relevant threats you've identified. Part three is your emergency response team, often called fire wardens. Now, what I often find is that wardens can be externally trained by experts in the field. So often, an external authority comes in and they give your fire wardens training, which is fantastic to get that advice from the experts. But what I often find is that the training is not always specific to your site's emergency plan. So I would encourage your business to, yes, indeed, have your fire wardens complete those external fire warden training, but also make sure you train your emergency team in your specific emergency response procedures. And indeed, train your staff in how they should react in these emergencies, which comes to part four, testing the plan. It's important to know that all of your fire emergency and fire response team understand the emergency plans and procedures. But also all the staff. So make sure this is included in their inductions and annual refresher training. Before you conduct drills, it's a great idea to actually inform the staff, refresh their knowledge of the emergency exit points, and test these evacuation routes. Interestingly, yesterday I was at a very high quality workplace, and just in walking around we found 2 of the emergency exit doors were quite difficult to open. So this is something that's really important, and this is what you learn from conducting your evacuation drills, so you can identify those problems and get them fixed. I also remind it's really valuable for your workplace to practice all your emergency scenarios, including, for example, external emergency, lockdown, chemical spills, not only emergency escape in the event of a fire. Thanks everyone that's already putting their comments in regarding our fire alarms required in the workplaces. We'll come back to that. Now, next, myself and Sue Ellen are going to talk to you about psychosocial risk management. We included this in the newsletter this month in particular because we're coming up to some important days for mental health, including September 10th, which I think is Sunday. This is known as World Suicide Prevention Day. And in Australia, we widely publicise September 14th, Are You OK Day. These days are opportunities for businesses to help raise awareness of mental illness and mental wellness, and to reduce the stigma of mental illness and encourage workers to check in on their co-workers' mental well-being. Now, what I do know is that many businesses and what they currently have in place, the common things businesses tell us that they're doing for mental health is having something in place like an employee assistance program, mental health first aiders, and other versions of intervention and sending workers off for treatment for mental illness. What you'll see is, I've put a little chart on the screen showing, these measures that we're talking about are often, they're reactive measures to something that's already gone wrong. Just a reminder, and some of your states have already implemented the psychosocial regulations, and we're looking to have those introduced sometime in the future of Victoria. And sorry, I don't have an update of when that will be. I believe that keeps getting pushed back. It's really important to start thinking about more proactive measures to promote mental well-being, because obviously our first preference, considering the hierarchy of control, is to eliminate unhealthy work conditions. So, as a business, you need to identify what potentially unhealthy work conditions are in your workplace. A good place to start is to, I guess, a little bit reactive, is to look at your workers, talk with them, and start to understand, areas that workers may already be showing symptoms of an unhealthy work condition or unhealthy workplace. Thank you, Cheryl. Indeed, the ISO 45003 standard, doing a gap analysis against that standard is a really great also a place to start to find out what you need to do to improve your mental wellbeing program. So now Sue Ellen is going to tell us about the 5 signs of distress in workers and how to intervene early.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. So as you mentioned, Thursday, September 14th is Are You OK Day, and this Sunday is World Suicide Prevention Day. So we encourage everyone to check in with your coworkers and their mental wellness. And there's always an obligation for managers to monitor the psychological health of their workers. So with this in mind, we've outlined in our newsletter the 5 signs of distress in workers which we can look out for. So number 1 is changes in their physical appearance. So are they displaying signs of fatigue? Do they seem more nervous than usual? Are they complaining of headaches? Do they appear to be breathing quickly or have shortness of breath? Number 2 would be changes in their behavior. So, do they seem withdrawn? And are they avoiding being in social situations? Are they distressed, or do they seem to be having difficulties concentrating whilst they're at work? Are there changes in their day-to-day behaviors? For example, do you notice that they're eating much more or much less than usual? Third sign would be changes in their mood. Do they seem anxious or irritable? Are they easily angered or quick to react more emotionally than usual? Number 4 would be changes in their thoughts, in how their thoughts are expressed. Are they saying things that sound more negative, or are they more suspicious of other people? And number 5 would be, have you noticed changes in their work? So do they complain that they're having difficulty switching off after work? And has there been a drop in their work performance? Or are they overwhelmed by tasks that they had previously found manageable, but now seem overwhelming? So these are the 5 signs of distress that we've outlined that you could identify in your coworkers. So if you have noticed a coworker displaying these symptoms, we do recommend checking in with them, and they may need some extra support. So the Beyond Blue website, for example, has a number of resources for support, and they do also have phone numbers for counselor services as well.
Thank you, Sue Ellen. That's really important to know. And these are, I guess, is a practical place for people to start when thinking about the welfare, the well-being of their co-workers and also family members. You might want to check in, but in the bigger picture, if you find your employees are showing, many of these signs of distress, this is probably a good indication that there's some areas of the work design or work environment that you should be looking at, and how could you make this a more healthy environment for your workers?
Yeah.
Now, the next item we want to talk about is a couple of incidents that occurred. We spoke to our team earlier in September and asked people to come forward with some ideas for articles, for our upcoming newsletter, and we got forward. Our team came up with some horror stories of things that had happened in workplaces recently. So this one that you can see now. It was actually a conviction. So an 18-year-old worker, his entire head was scalped by the packing machine. So the chain drive and sprocket was unguarded, and the hair got caught in there and ripped off the entire scalp, which was obviously traumatic for the worker. And so this 18-year-old worker was severely injured. And what the court found, significant in this conviction was that the company had foreseen the risk. And in fact, in their own risk assessment 7 years prior to the incident, had identified the risk of this unguarded chain drive, and they hadn't implemented the guarding. 7 years later, the worker suffered the serious injury and they were fined $120,000. So, of course, this is a reminder to all businesses that have machinery to check the guarding of equipment in your workplace, and where you do identify a serious hazard or unguarded machinery, it's important to make an action plan to address the serious hazards and actually implement the control measures. Another serious incident, this one happened in August. A Victorian worker died after he was crushed between the basket of a boom type elevating work platform. It's believed that as the platform was raised towards the roof, the worker was actually crushed between the basket and the roof above him. It's not the first. There's been several of these fatal incidents that have occurred in workplaces over many years. So WorkSafe Victoria in particular has some really helpful guidance for workplaces to have a look at and look how you can eliminate or reduce the risks of a crush injury for operators of elevated work platforms. Now, the serious incidents that I've heard about mainly relate to the boom type elevating work platform, but it could also apply with the scissor lift. So make sure you can consider these hazards and controls for both. Firstly is that there can be engineering controls. So either purchasing a safer elevating work platform or retrofitting some additional guarding or safety measures to the EWP. So what you'll see on the screen in the middle picture is installing like a physical barrier, like a crush protection structure around the operator's position. Which we understand is not always practical for certain works. But there's also other devices such as height sensing devices, which can either stop the EWP and lower it back down or simply be an audible alert. One that I think is quite practical is the device on the right, a pressure sensing device. So it firstly acts as like an e-stop for the worker, so they could quickly push that. Or if the worker falls down onto the controls area, again, that pressure sensing device will stop the EWP and depends how it's designed, might lower it back down. As for engineering controls, it's also important to look at the way that the controls are programmed. Some EWPs require, for example, a foot and a hand control to be used to be operated at the same time. And as soon as the operator releases either the foot or the hand, the EWP will immediately stop. So make sure you understand those devices that exist on your EWPs and look at improving the engineering controls if possible. The next part is having very safe practices for the operation of the elevating work platforms, especially where there is overhead structures. So WorkSafe recommends that workers not work alone, and best practice companies require a safety observer on the ground in all cases. So this safety observer is trained in operation of the emergency controls. So they would be also spotting for the worker, looking out for those overhead obstructions, and if the worker was in an unsafe position, they can immediately push the emergency stop and lower the EWP back down. And of course, it's important to consider the surroundings. So workers should always check the work area before starting work and being well aware of any overhead obstructions. Discussing these in pre-start toolboxes and including the controls in the safe work method statement where possible. Now, thank you, Sue Ellen, has added in the links to these YouTube clips, which I found very helpful in explaining the recommended controls for these overhead obstructions. So if you click on the links in the chat, you'll open those up. Now, question of the week. And now what we have asked is, I guess we've asked this question in a couple of ways. And Sue Ellen did some research on this one about the question of the week: are fire alarms required in all workplaces? And I guess we had a bit of a yes/no answer to this one. Did you want to tell us about that, Sue Ellen?
Trina and Cheryl said no, and Rick and Catherine said yes. So
and I think we can say
they're
actually both right.
Yes, so basically the requirement for a building to include fire alarms is really dependent on what's outlined in the building's occupancy certificate. So yeah, that's what it basically depends on. There's no legal requirement in any legislation for a building to have fire alarms. Um, However, the Australian standard does require a building to have a suitable arrangement to advise occupants and visitors of a fire emergency, and this should be outlined in the workplace's emergency response procedures. So even though it's not a legal requirement to have fire alarms, the Australian standard does require you to have arrangements in place to advise the occupants of a building that there is an emergency happening. And so I guess alarms would be a good way to do that.
Fantastic. And so if what we understand is certain buildings will require an alarm based on the class of building per the building code. So those will be in place. And if I believe what you told me, Sue Ellen, is if they are required to have a fire alarm as part of that building code requirement, they do have to maintain and test those alarms.
Yep. So it's required to be checked monthly or as determined by the Emergency Planning Committee.
Excellent. And then, of course, if your building wasn't required to have an alarm per the occupancy certificate, there isn't a require. The WHS regulations don't specifically require you to install one.
Yeah.
However, what we know is good practice is you need to have a way to alert people of an emergency and get it. And as we know, you have that general duty that you must be able to safely evacuate people in an emergency. But thanks, Mick. Mick's pointing out, you don't necessarily have to have an installed alarm. You can use alternatives such as Mick suggested. You could use a whistle. You can use a megaphone. You can use certain apps, that to tell people there's an emergency. And of course, many of you might remember, construction sites often have the winding alarm. So you can have a way to manually raise an alarm in the workplace. So just keep that in mind. But the most important thing is that you do have a way to alert people of an emergency and that you test it so people actually know if they hear that sound, what it's telling them to do. I've been at workplaces where we've done practice drills and use things like portable air horns. And in one case, these air horns, they weren't tested very often and it looked a bit old. And when we actually tried to use it for a practice drill, the device just fell apart. It didn't make a noise. The horn just fell off and it didn't work. So the important thing is to have a reliable device with the sound or whatever method you use is that people recognize it and know how to evacuate. So thank you everyone for your feedback on that question. And indeed, you were all right. There is, what does the law require and what should you have in place? So we really like your answers there. Feel free to send in your safety questions of the week or month if any of you have a great question or if you've recently learned something with a surprising answer, feel free to send us through. We'd love to hear about it. Now let me tell you about next month. Importantly, October is National Safe Work Month. So check out Safe Work Australia's website for like printable promotion materials. And also many of the states' WorkSafe authorities are hosting events. WorkSafe in Victoria has got a lot of regional events as well as webinars. Make sure you check those out. We'll also be talking about crisis management versus emergency management, telling you what is the difference. And our question of the month is, what is wrong with this sign? Feel free to send any wrong safety signs that you've come across to us before our next webinar. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope you will join us again for our next webinar on Friday, the 13th of October.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, everyone, for your involvement and feedback today. Have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully it warms up wherever you are.
Yeah.